Thank you.
Have fun.
Thanks. When I was a kid, I used to travel to visit my grandparents in Philadelphia, and they had a huge stack of Saturday evening posts that I would peruse for hours because there was nothing else to do in the days before the internet, of course. And this experience gave me a sense of the speaking words of Norman Rockwell through his paintings. Now, my kids that I teach as a law professor don't really relate much to Norman Rockwell, so I can't really use this much in my ordinary teaching, but I thought maybe here today I could evoke something with you, a recognition of the contrast between the world that Rockwell was depicting and the world we find ourselves in today. So Rockwell was obsessed with trains. And trains, of course, at the beginning of his life at least, defined the greatness of America. Trains. Here's a picture of China. Ooh, that's not China, that's China. You can't really tell much from this image. If you could take away the brown lines, what you would see is 18,000 miles of high-speed rail in China today, built essentially over the last dozen years. Here's a similar map of America. There's no high-speed rail on this map. We have a higher speed rail, less than 150 miles per hour in the Northeast Corridor, but nowhere else in the United States. Now, you might say China's much bigger than the United States. You'd be wrong if you said that. You might say America loves roads. Of course we do. Might be a little puzzled by this image because they're on the wrong side of the road. I thought this might be Australia, but in fact, they're driving on the right side. This is just classic American drivers going up over a cliff on the wrong side of the road. But yes, of course we love our roads, but even here, according to the civil engineers of America, we are more than $1.5 trillion behind in funding the infrastructure we need to bring America to the level that we thought our aspirations would speak to. Or think about healthcare. Rockwell did many of these images of this quaint and beautiful image of healthcare in America. You all know the numbers, the statistics that show how costs in America are wildly above costs around the rest of the world, and what they deliver is much less. Even in comparable countries, we are 2 times as great as the mean. And even when you separate out the GDP and the cost per healthcare, the United States is way off the graph. Or think about education. You know these statistics in education. The red lines here are the means for math proficiency. You have to go very far down the list before you find a country that is worse than the United States. Or maybe most importantly, this was an image he called utopia. This idea, an American ideal, the Horatio Alger ideal that somehow in this great country we'd find better than anywhere else in the world the opportunity to rise. That truth today is no longer a truth today, as many competitors around the world find easier to demonstrate the capacity for social rise than the United States. These are changes. Changes in the United States, and I want you to think about the way they're related to changes in our government. I want you to recognize the way in which our government is failing. You might say, what's a law professor going to tell me about government failing? So I'll evoke not law professors, but the business school at Harvard here. This extraordinary work by Catherine Gell and Michael Porter. The politics industry is failing America, they say. Or more specifically, the competition in the politics industry is failing America. The business school did a survey of all of the graduates they could get to respond and asked them to identify the elements of the business environment circa 2016. And notice how in the worst quadrant are each of these elements that I described, and the political system as the thing that Harvard Business School graduates identified as the factor holding America back. As they put it, it's often said that Washington is broken, but this is widely held belief reflects a common misunderstanding of the problem. In fact, Washington is delivering exactly what it's currently designed to deliver. The real problem is that our political system is no longer designed to serve the public interest. By nearly every measure, the industry of politics itself is thriving. The people whom the politic industry is supposed to serve have never been more dissatisfied. And indeed, the numbers bear them out. This is the decline in public trust in the federal government. This is the increasing gridlock in Congress over important issues. This graph shows you the number of times Democrats and Republicans can work together. Notice, in the end, in the most significant landmark legislation, there is no working together across the lines. Here's the decline in moderates in the United States Senate, the decline in moderates in the US House. These are together a signal of a very technical legal term. That legal term is a bad political reality at the core of this extraordinary American republic. So why? I want to start by saying it has nothing to do with this man. It's not about a man, a party. It's not even about what's going on right now. Instead, what this is what Francis Fukuyama calls the problem of a veto-ocracy, a vetocracy. A vetocracy that has developed in America over many, many years. Indeed, if you think back to the framing and ask, what was the number of people in our government that it took to veto new ideas becoming law? The framers of our Constitution were obsessed with a very complicated system, almost a Swiss watch-like system that we now call the Constitution, creating elaborate checks and balances to slow the process of legislating. But in that system, the majority of one house could block any new idea from becoming law. Now, the Constitution, when it was framed, never imagined political parties. George Washington thought they would be the great downfall of a republic. But very soon into the republic, parties emerged. And when the parties emerged, what that meant is the number that it took to veto was the majority in one party. Now, most of the history of America, though, has had parties of a very particular kind. Parties for most of America were mixed politically. They were conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. But as this book demonstrates, Sam Rosenfeld very powerfully, in the 70s and 80s, the parties in America became ideological. They became much more clearly Republican on the right and Democrat on the left. And what that meant is the number it took to veto any change was the majority of one faction of one party. And then in the mid to 1990s, this man, Newt Gingrich, radically changed the job of being a congressman by turning congressmen into petty fundraisers. The parties became mechanisms for facilitating fundraising to fund the campaigns to get these candidates back into power. It became a focus on money. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress now spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back into power, dialing for dollars. My students are sometimes puzzled by this device, but you all know this is a telephone, dialing for dollars. But what they're calling is not the average American. They're calling no more than 100,000 Americans who fund their campaigns. And as they do that, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money. B.F. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box where any stupid animal could learn which buttons it needed to push to get the sustenance it needed to survive. This is the picture of a life of a member of Congress now. as they develop this innate sense of how they need to bend to get the sustenance they need for their parties to survive. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." Then she clarified very quickly, he was not an environmentalist. So the point is, in this world where congressmen are fundraisers, where they spend half their time on the phones raising money, the number of people or forces necessary to veto new change is a few big funders of these campaigns. The number to veto has constantly shrunk, which means we have established this vetocracy, which means we have established a government that cannot govern. I don't care what issue you might care about, whether it's climate change or artificial intelligence and work or the data surveillance system that we see out there or financial security of the infrastructure of our financial system. Until we fix this, we will have no sensible policy out of our government anywhere. Okay, now, the hopeful sign about this fact is that about this, we the people are united. Extraordinary study at the University of Maryland conducted in the middle of the 2016 campaign found almost universal agreement about the basic nature of this frustration in our government and the causes. So this study asked, does Congress serve the common good of the people? 85% said that it does not. 87% of Republicans, 84% of Democrats. Corporations and their lobbyists have too much influence. 89% of voters agreed with that, 89% of Republicans, 90% of Democrats. Elected officials think more about the interests of their campaign donors than the common good of the people, 89% of voters, 92% of Republicans, 88% of Democrats. Big campaign donors have too much influence, 91% of voters, 90% of Republicans, 91% of Democrats. On this issue, this divided nation, this polarized nation is united. We all have this sense of the dysfunction of our government, and we all attribute that dysfunction to the same vetocracy-related influence. And so you could look at that fact and you could say, wow, we could actually rally the people. We should unite them behind this idea that this is the problem that we must find the strength to resolve. So is that a reason for hope? My sense is the answer is nope. And the reason for that is we don't live our lives in this common ground. We live our lives in tribes. The business model of politics, and more importantly, media, where we live in tribes, is a business model of hate, teaching us how to hate the other side and rallying us to the cause of that hatred. The business model of media in this age of tribes is not Walter Cronkite. It is figures like this and like this. And this separation is growing. It's an extraordinary study by Martin and Urich, well, I don't know. You can read it. I can't pronounce it. Is a content analysis of news on cable news stations. And the content analysis evaluates the political orientation of these news stations, what the messages were. Were they on the right or on the left or in the middle? And you see in 2001, CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC are basically at the same place. The predictability of the ideology is zero, meaning you can't really tell whether they're conservative or liberal or not. But watch what happens over the period since then. The business model of cable news is partisan, because partisan pays. And the more partisan pays more. The more you can develop this partisan infrastructure, the more it rewards the advertisers who reward the networks. And this reward is not through choices, it's through the preferences of us, of the audience. And the editors are responding to these preferences. Now, we have to be very careful about this word editors in the modern digital age. When you think about editors, you think about somebody in an eye shade sitting there scratching out on a paper which will be on the front page and which won't. The reality of selection of content today is that it's driven by computers, by AI. The page that you see, whether it's Huffington Post or on the right, whatever you might watch, is constantly adjusted based on who is clicking on what. Even the headlines are changing as a function of what gets more response. It's constantly growing in its intelligence about what you want as it separates you, sorts you into increasingly partisan buckets. The AI is the editors, and sometimes the AI goes a little bit nuts. In the fall of 2017, there was an extraordinary story about Facebook, where it turned out that Facebook was selling ads in a category called Jew haters. If you wanted to advertise to Jew haters, Facebook had a category you could select, Jew haters. Now you might wonder, who in Facebook is so anti-Semitic as to sell Jew haters as a category? And the answer is, there was no human who ever created the category Jew haters in Facebook. Jew haters was a category that the AI generated itself by watching what people were saying and deciding this might be a category that would sell. And indeed, it did sell. And when Facebook was discovered by ProPublica to be doing this, they had to say, look, the machine made us do it. We didn't do it. It was the machine that did it. AI is driven by us. It reflects us. But more importantly, as it reflects us, it makes us. It makes us even more polarized. If media's business is to polarize, it has an interest in dividing us, because dividing us is profitable to them. And as you see from this extraordinary Pew study, as we have evolved over this period of time, we have become ever more clearly sorted or divided into these separations, which might evoke Tom Paine's stealing the idea, it turns out, from many years earlier, united we stand, then divided do we fall? So this brings me to the argument I want to make about leadership. What leadership here must mean. Leadership. First, it's an attitude. I was on a hike with a friend who was a member of the military, a captain, a man who had led soldiers into battle, a commander. I was kind of the opposite. I had never led anybody except terrify a bunch of students. I had never done anything really significant. So I spoke to him as someone with incredible respect. But I said to him, Sean, who are they? And he said, what do you mean? I said, who are these people who volunteer to go to war? I said, what do you mean, Larry? I said, what do they think? What do they care about? Why do they do what they do? And he said, I don't know. You know, they're people who want to feel like they can do something bigger than themselves, but not smaller than the ideals of this nation. And then he said the line that stuck with me, nobody goes to war for a party. They go to war for their country. Not party, but country over party. That's the attitude. And then there is the practice. People look at the picture of the framers of our Constitution and they say, hey, here's a bunch of rich white men. And from that they say, this is not a diverse mix of America at the time. And of course, in many important ways, it's not diverse. But listen to the most important diversity that's at the core of that mix of 54 men. A significant chunk of that group thought slavery was the moral abomination of the age, and an equally significant chunk of that group thought slavery was God's command to us. There could be no issue greater in disagreement than that issue of slavery. And yet they were able to bracket that difference long enough to craft a constitution that would save this nation from collapsing into the oblivion it was guaranteed to collapse into, not by compromising on their principles, but by recognizing they needed to step above the division, that what divided them could not define them, that they had to unite behind something more fundamental. In that, they were practicing something that it's so hard for us ourselves to practice. They were practicing being united. They disciplined themselves to think beyond their difference in everything they did, and this is what we, especially you, must do. In every moment of your existence, as you're thrown by the things you watch and read into these separate buckets, you also have to experience and practice this idea that we are not just Republicans and Democrats, but we are citizens first, Americans first. And if we don't find a way back to that place, we will not find a future for this nation. And then finally, point number 3, a belief. I've told this story before. Let me share it once again. So I once gave a lecture at Dartmouth, and after I was finished, a woman said to me, "Professor, you've convinced me. It's absolutely hopeless, and there's nothing we can do." And I realized that was a moment of failure. And what was I going to do in response to this? And for some reason, I haven't had a chance to talk to my shrink yet about this, but for some reason, what came into my head at that moment was the image of my then 6-year-old beautiful boy. And in my head was the thought that a doctor came to me and said, "Your son has terminal brain cancer, and there's nothing we can do." And I thought, if he said that to me, would I do nothing? And of course, the answer is no. What love means is that you do everything, the odds be damned. And then I thought, even we liberals can love our country. And that what this is a fight for love. It's love of country that has to convince us that we must rise above the place we have been put and find a way back to a democracy that can speak to the best of us. Because we are that nation. We are that tradition. We are that beauty that Rockwell celebrated. And we must find the Americans who can bring that back to us. Thank you very much.